Our guest in the pulpit this morning is Dr. Cathie English. She teaches undergraduate and graduate English education at Missouri State University. Previously, she worked for 22 years in secondary English in rural Nebraska. Her research focuses upon place-conscious education with an emphasis in community literacy, teacher leadership, and composition theory and practice. Dr. English's work centers students' understanding of themes larger than secondary education, asking them to possess a deep understanding of themselves and their role within a place. It is within this grasp for extensive knowledge that students are empowered for a lifetime of teaching and learning. Her own journey in place-conscious pedagogy began in 1997 at the first Nebraska Writing Project Rural Institute in Henderson, Nebraska, where local teachers first exposed her to the concept. Since that time, she has grown as a place-conscious educator who has advocated for the integration of a curriculum that acknowledges the need to understand our locale in mindful ways and asks these essential questions. What does it mean to live well communally, ecologically, economically, politically, and spiritually? What does it mean to share a biome with other species? How do we sustain our locale for multiple generations? The title of Dr. English's presentation is Naming What We Don't Know. Welcome, Dr. Cathie English.
Good morning. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you, Dacia, for such a lovely introduction. I thought I'd tell you a little bit more about me. That was more of my professional introduction. I thought you might want to know a little bit more about me personally. I also want to thank AJ for including Hope is the Thing with Feathers. I recited as you talked. She's one of my favorite poets. My book of her collection is completely falling apart. And two of her very short poems are, A letter is a joy of earth, it is denied the gods. And another short one is, in this short life that only lasts an hour, how much, how little is within our power. I love those two. I don't know why, but my parents decided to name me Cathie, and my last name was Cave, so I was Cathie Cave for a long time. And I've always thought that was like interesting to be, to have that. Is it alliteration or, yeah, it's alliteration. I always think, is it assonance, consonants, or alliteration? I'm an English teacher. I have 11 siblings. There were 6 boys and 6 girls. When people ask me where I'm at, I always say I'm number 5 of 12. I grew up in a small town of Silver Creek, Nebraska, about 480 people. And it's right along the Lincoln Highway, US Highway 30. You go right through it. If you blink, you'll miss it. Between the Loup River and to the north and the Platte River to the south, it was about a mile. I could walk to it anytime I wanted to. We had no air conditioning in the summer, and I had summers of vegetables and canning and 98% humidity. I spent a lot of time outdoors to escape all of the cacophony of all those people, 14 people in one house. And I also spent many hours in the 3 vegetable gardens of my Polish babcia. She kept 3 gardens every summer, and I picked a lot of green beans in my youth. Luckily, I still love them. I'm married to Jerry for 44 years, this April 21st. We have 2 children, John and Anna, and they're born on the same day, 14 years apart. John is married to Amanda, and we have 4 grandchildren, Joey, Rory, Benji, and Lucy. And our daughter Anna just got married this last summer to Kevin. But today I'm here to talk about naming what we love, what we don't know. So during the pandemic, I fell in love with weeds, or more specifically, native species. I've loved vegetables and cultivated flowers for a lifetime, but the pandemic pushed me to learn more and love more about this earth and the species it sustains. It pushed me to pay attention to the language of animacy, to listen more closely to the grammar of the other. I live on the edge of Springfield in Greene County, Missouri, and for 9 consecutive months daily, I walked 20,000 steps, and those walks occurred on the trail in our neighborhood. I had recently seen the plat map of a new subdivision off ours, plans for 300 new homes. The snap of tree trunks and the drone of bulldozers beckoned me to the trail, to enjoy it while I still could, even though its vivisection was almost more than I could bear. It's not a long trail, and it mostly meanders behind homeowners' properties, but the contractor who invested in the subdivision extended it to the nearest blacktop, Farm Road 115, Hazeltine Road. It's that 1,800 feet beyond our subdivision that taught me to love weeds and to know their names. In Naming What We Love, a chapter from his book, Grassroots, The Universe of Home, Paul Grukow tells a story about his neighbor calling the town's weed inspector because of the condition of his yard. In a conversation with the weed inspector, Grukow was stunned that the weed inspector couldn't name a single weed his neighbor objected to. The weed inspector told him to cut them all down to save a lot of trouble. Before he left, he asked Grukow, "Do you know what they are?" And Grukow responded, "Yes, and I don't mind making a little trouble if it comes to that." Grukow also tells a story of taking 60 of Minnesota's brightest students from a local school to walk along a lake they were familiar with. He bemoaned that most students, beyond a few farm kids, could name any of the plants. The dandelion was the only plant they all knew. They didn't recognize cattails. Most of them couldn't tell the difference between a willow tree and a cottonwood tree. They have wandered and played along that lake shore for a lifetime, utterly blind to it. Grukow acknowledges that Santee youth observing that lake 200 years ago would have been less ignorant and would have had the language to describe the landscape. Grukow is speaking of the Siouan tribe, the Santee, members of the Eastern Dakota Band of the Sioux Nation, who inhabited both northern and southern Minnesota in the 18th and 19th centuries. Even a farming child 75 years ago could likely name several species. Grukow reminds me it's important to know the names of living things and just how many there are yet to name, citing that even though we have named and learned of thousands of species across the globe and have unlocked the mysteries of DNA and multiple galaxies, species remain unknown to us. E.g., or for example, 95% of organisms in soil ecosystems have never been identified. In the year he penned Grassroots, 1995, fewer people were aware of the climate crisis. Almost 30 years ago, he understood. He writes, "We have learned in recent times to fear for the earth, for its sudden apparent fragility, and for all that we obviously do not know about it. But fear is no basis for an intelligent relationship. Ignorance and indulgence preempt the love that is required of us. We will love the earth more completely, more effectively, by being able to know something about the life it sustains. Indigenous people have known and loved the earth for a millennium. We should learn from them about the life it sustains. But first, we must deepen our practice of land acknowledgement. A few months ago, Colleen Apple asked me to come and speak about the importance of land acknowledgement, why it's important to say the names of the indigenous people who once inhabited this land for centuries prior to European colonization. In order to understand its importance, we must experience vulnerability. To name what we don't know requires risk. It's risky to name what we don't know or understand. We'll have to come to terms with our ignorance or indifference. We'll have to come to terms with emotions we weren't expecting, joy or sorrow or regret. Like many, I have had a certain degree of indifference about weeds. Most of the modern world just wants to kill them off, poison them out of existence like the weed inspector and Paul grew cows in Minnesota home. I have a lot of regret that I once didn't understand why naming the tribal nations was an important step in what David Greenwood names decolonization soul work. I was embarrassed about my ignorance because my master's thesis focused upon the concept of Lakota vision quests and their connection to the land. Surely, I should have been acknowledging Indigenous people in my formal ceremony, conference, university course, or communications. Earlier, I mentioned I lived in Silver Creek, Nebraska, but I was completely unaware that 10 miles away in my father's hometown of Genoa, Nebraska, there was an Indian industrial school where young boys of various tribes were assimilated, forced to cut their hair, give up their language, and separated from their families. My good friend Steve Willis, an art professor at MSU and a member of the Potawatomi tribe, acknowledges Indigenous peoples in all his communications. For him, a descendant of the Potawatomi nation, it's an act of decolonization to use the names of the tribes in their own languages. He writes, "I acknowledge that I work in Missouri, the homelands of tribal nations, Nutachi, Chewere, Wazaje, Opaka, and Chikasha, among others. These names might not be familiar to you. You'll know the names given by those who came to colonize, that is, Missouri, Oto, Osage, Arkansas, Arquapa, and Chickasaw." Tim Lilburn of the University of Victoria, British Columbia, writes that we must begin a reconciliation conversation about colonization and the harm done to Indigenous people. He cites his colleague Tayake Alfred. "The problem has been framed in many complicated ways. But really, what is colonization if not separation of the people from the land? The severance of the bond of trust and love that held our people together so tightly in the not so distant past, and the abandonment of our spiritual connection to the natural world. I believe a connection to the land is vital to my own spirituality. I have sought to understand what that means for most of my adult life. But my origins of the connectedness to the land is Poland, Austria, and Wales." Scott Russell Sanders writes, "One's native ground is the place where, since before you had words for such knowledge, you have known the smells, the seasons, the birds and beasts, the human voices, the houses, the way of working, the lay of the land, and the quality of light. Even if you become intimate with new landscapes, you still bear the impression of that first ground. If I could go back, I wonder how much of my ancestors' understanding of the land would emerge in my intuitive knowing. My ancestors left of their own volition. That is not true for any indigenous tribes in the American continent. So how do we rebuild the bond of trust and love that held indigenous people together? Naming the tribes is one small step towards reconciliation. We have a long way to go in the decolonization soul work David Greenwood describes. In 2011, I co-facilitated a Nebraska Writing Project Summer Institute focused upon Native American literature. I reread Black Elk Speaks for the third time, but this time I read the updated edition that distinguished Black Elk's words from John Neihart's poetic license. That's a decolonization at work. We arranged for our graduate students to travel to the Nebraska State Men's Penitentiary in Tecumseh, ironically, for a sing with the Spiritual and Cultural Alliance members. Before the drum ceremony, pairs of students met with the men, and we asked them what we could do as English teachers. And without consulting with each other, all inmates said the same thing: tell the truth about us and take care of the earth. Greenwood calls this soul work a cosmological homecoming. I like that. But how do we return home to the nature of the universe? To do as Sherman Paul advises, to re-enter the world, participate in it, and recover respect for it. To do so, we must begin at home, here. Go out, look around. Are you willing to become vulnerable? To take a risk? Name what you don't know. A new way of thinking, another person, another tribe. Or while sitting in your own backyard, will you name the weeds? Like me, will you fall in love with them? Thank you.